Well, I can definitely see all of the liberties that Samurai Jack has with the show being on Adult Swim now. And to talk more about this episode review, alrighty guys, it is Qaaman here today giving you my Season 5 Episode 8 review today. So, I'm just going to talk about the episode as a whole. The whole purpose of this episode is to show off a theme in Samurai Jack representing American culture, where in the American culture that we have today, we come from a puritanical society. Obviously, because we derive from the Puritans, who have a lot of problems with sex, but they don't necessarily have a problem with violence. And if you look at this Samurai Jack episode, this episode illustrated that theme to the highest exponent. Because if you think about it, throughout this episode, which the plot doesn't matter, the whole plot of this episode is completely irrelevant to the future of Samurai Jack, and it's completely irrelevant to the story. The plot doesn't matter. It's what the show was trying to show you. And what it shows you is that we're watching two warrior-like characters in Jack and Ashi literally going throughout the episode, beating up tiger-like creatures, slashing up all of these monsters, killing left and right with no regard and fighting. And yet, as they're killing these leech-like creatures and they're fighting these tiger-like creatures, we're seeing all of this violence. But yet, when Ashi was naked, we had a problem with that. It was so inappropriate for Jack, who is this big, powerful, tough, heroic guy that we've been seeing for all of these years, and yet he's embarrassed to look at a naked woman. And this was obviously shown because Ashi herself was like, what's the big deal? Okay, I'm naked. And in essence, this was kind of a nod to not Ashi herself, because Ashi has been naked throughout the entire Samurai Jack series, as she had all of that suit on her skin. So, the whole theme of this episode was, we're so accustomed to seeing violence and there's no problem with that, but a nude woman, oh, we gotta put a sword and a gown over her to hide it because we can't show a naked woman. And that was a brilliant thing that this episode showed. And in addition to all of this stuff, this episode had some other themes in it of sexism, and one of them was when Jack and Ashi are, running through the prison, and they're jumping all those platforms, and Jack was like, hey Ashi, you might want to watch your step as you're jumping across, and then she just goes and does it easily, and then looks at him, she's like, oh, well, you were saying something? And that is a representation of how, in the society that we have today, a man is kind of timid for to have a strong woman. And that's kind of more of a West, and this isn't necessarily just a Western thing, this applies to all cultures to a degree, in general sexism, where a man feels kind of intimidated by having a strong woman around him, a woman that can fight on par with him and wipe out a whole military by herself, as we saw in the last episode, and kill her own mother to save this guy, for crying out loud. And that was an interesting thing about, the whole sexism elements in it. And to talk more about some specific elements about this, Samurai Jack, from what we know, we don't know about his sexual history, but it's probable that he is a virgin in this series, and it's probable that Ashi is a virgin herself, considering the fact that when you look at Samurai Jack, he's been pretty much fighting and killing his entire life. And to another degree, Ashi's kind of been the same, where her whole life, she's been fighting and killing too, to kill Samurai Jack. So you have these two people who are literally complete warriors, where they've literally been fighting their entire lives, or for a large portion of their life, and yet have never experienced something as simple as sex because of all of what they have been programmed to do instinctively from such a young age, one in defense and one in human programming in Ashi. And together, this whole episode was to hype up the huge sex scene, or the intended sex scene at the end of it. And there were so many cues that hinted at all of this, where, when the leech-like creatures got a hold of, Ashi, and Samurai Jack was licking Samurai Jack was licking the little leech-like creature's leg, you know, like sucking it off as if he's like somehow getting a sick pleasure out of pleasuring Ashi, and he was actually smiling as he was doing it, and she was kind of, you know, she was kind of surprised about it herself, and she was like, thank you, as if he was giving her some sort of favor. And as they fight this Lazarus creature, like, to be honest with you guys, the plot doesn't even matter. The point of this episode is the messages it was trying to say. So when they're fighting this huge Lazarus-like creature, and, you know, Jack was trying to, you know, put on the little remote so that he could wipe out all of those leeches that were on her. One other thing that we noticed in watching this episode, me and my dad, is that Ashi was the one who was defending Jack as he was trying to, you know, figure out a way to maneuver and, you know, actually fix the whole thing. And that's also another thing, like, he's having his woman, or future woman, I guess, defending him as a result of him being goofy and not being able to focus completely on the objectives at hand. And that's another nod to the sexism elements where, you know, in Samurai Jack, he's kind of thinking, oh, I have to protect her, but in essence, she's kind of protecting him. So that's another quick thing about sexism I wanted to point out. But, you know, as they finally figured out how to activate that device, and Jack and Ashi were being, you know, sucked in by this creature, and literally, you know, and the electricity was going off, and they were acting like they were, you know, they weren't acting, but they were actually being electrocuted and, you know, being shocked by all of that. You hear all of those sexual moans and groans, and after all of it, they're like panting very hard as if they just finished sexual intercourse. And I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I mean, you know, Ashi did have some, you know, leftover, you know, leech guts over her face, and the same thing for Jack, sort of like, you know, Jack kind of skeeted on her head. And that was obviously intended by the audience, you know, intended by the creators of the show, considering the fact that they've been hinting all these things earlier on. You go back to the scene where they're fighting all of those tiger-like creatures. You see a scene where Jack is acting like, oh yeah, I'm sorry for my sword, it's poking you. It's obviously showing that, like, Jack is having an erection being so close to a woman in such proximity. And, you know, this episode was just brilliant all in one, because Jack and Ashi grew up at the end of the episode. They became and fulfilled adulthood by having sex, because their whole life, or at least the intended sex scene, because their whole life they've been fighting and not even been doing the most realistic thing that all humans are designed to do, to reproduce, which is have sex. And have you not noticed that all of those leeches, there's numerous leeches of this big Lazarus-like creature, and that's a whole nod to the fact that it's like talking about reproduction, kind of like you were talking about sperms. And, you know, between Jack and Ashi, you have like a form of reproduction in between each other. And, you know, it's kind of like having sex is the metaphor, and all of those leech-like creatures represents like an infant or a baby being born, representing the entire human cycle. And that's what my dad and I were talking about as we were watching this episode. So when the end of this episode came, they actually played a different theme song for it as compared to what we've normally seen in Samurai Jack reviews, and it was a song called Everybody Loves Somebody Somehow by Dean Martin. I actually looked the song up, and this was a song from many years ago. And that song, if you really think about it, that represents the fact that despite the fact that these two people are on, you know, mortal opposite sides, where Ashi is literally being trained from birth to kill Jack, and Jack has literally been training all of these years to fight off threats like Ashi, in essence, love still exists in the world. And you could be the most cold-blooded, sinister thinking person in the world that has been programmed to kill somebody, and yet you can still fall in love with them. And in Jack's case, you can be a guy who's been fighting his entire life, never having time to really settle down with a woman, even though, you know, we've seen in Samurai Jack, most notably, there was an episode, Aku was disguising himself as a woman many episodes back. So Jack has been around women before, but he's never really been with a woman to this extent where they're literally fighting to take down this massive threat together to this degree, with all of this development for so many episodes at a time. And I think that's truly the sign of what that song represented, that after all of what's happened and after all of what's done, you can find somebody in the end. There's always somebody out there for you, and no matter what lifestyle you have, there's always love in the air in the weirdest fucking forms that you can imagine, guys. I thought this episode was brilliant. I have way more to say. You know, there's some notes I took down with my dad, but I really feel like this concludes a good, solid episode review for you guys. And I spoke from the heart, guys. I really honestly spoke from the heart in this episode review, guys. Let me know what you think in the comment section below about this episode. This was probably the most unique, deep, realistic Samurai Jack episode I've ever seen. I've never seen an episode with so many giggly elements that made you think to this degree, and how we're so interested in talking about violence, but we're so scared to talk about sex, even though sex isn't even really that bad considering that it's natural. And it was a brilliant episode, guys. I really want to know what you guys think. And in addition to this episode review, please check out my friend JaxBlade's episode review of episode 8 of Samurai Jack in my description, as he too has his own take on how he thought this episode went. He does great reviews, and I'm sure you guys will love it. With everything else said, guys, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as I always say, to have a great day, guys, and I'm gonna go jack off after this episode.